What are the best gems in the game for Diablo 4? Well, it depends on the character that you play. So there's going to be an updated guide as things have kind of changed up in the game. So starting right off, it does depend on the class that you play because some of these effects on these gems will simply not apply because your character cannot make use out of, let's say, thorns or any of the other ones. Like having max life is always good on most characters. However, there could be a stat that you want to prioritize, getting extra defenses while a condition is met. So let's go over what's going to be good for most players over here. So another question I always get asked is, how do we craft these gems? What are the requirements? So in order to craft the higher level gems, you just have to be a higher level. You don't have to level these up at the certain vendor like you would at Diablo 3's vendors. So these ones you just acquire the higher tier as you go up in level, and it's just going to require a higher level. Now, in order to answer the question, is it even worth keeping your older gems? Not really, unless you plan to make another character that is going to start off obviously at a lower level, but more likely at that point you will have a friend to hopefully power level you up, so you can just get rid of the older ones at the end of the day. But if you are making another character, yeah, they do have different level requirements, but for the most part, I would say it's not something that you really need to worry about. You don't need to start saving a bunch of your older gems, as there was a data mine that does show off that there's going to be another 3 tier of gems that will be coming out later to the game. But at the end of the day, it depends on the class that you're playing. So this is going to apply for most characters, okay? Keep that in mind. So starting right off, in the game, there's basically 3 different categories. We have our armor pieces, we have our weapons, as well as our offhands, and then we have our jewelry. That's kind of how the gems are separated in terms of what they actually do, depending on the different category. So starting right off, in terms of the armor category, that's our helmet, our chest piece, our gloves, as well as our pants and boots. Those are like the defensive items. You can only socket in the helm 1 socket. In the chest piece, you can socket 2, and you can socket 2 in your pants as well. You can go over to the jeweler and actually socket these in. To get these, you need to do the world bosses, but you can still get them in other places as well, but that's the primary area. So in terms of the armor pieces, what do we want to get? There's actually 2 different options for most classes. That is getting damage reduction while controlled impaired. So what does this mean? So anytime that you're slowed, you're frozen, anything that affects your character's movement, right? So your character's not able to play the game. That is what the damage reduction while controlled impaired means. Topazes will be kind of the best in slot for most players. However, there is also the argument that rubies are very good. So what are the 2 differences between the rubies as well as the topaz? So rubies will always give you maximum life. So this will really help out with maybe an enemy that's hitting you super far away. Those bone archers that are the little like turret things, those hit for a huge amount of damage. And if you are obviously affected by a crowd control, you can actually take a lot less damage than having more life by putting in a topaz. Now, most characters will want to get some form of unstoppable, so you're not going to be stunned, you're not going to be frozen, you're not going to be affected by basically negative movement effects. So if your character can keep up, you do have a better chance at maybe using the rubies. However, I have seen also some people play with sapphires. This is extra damage reduction while fortified. Now, if your character cannot use fortified, then this gem is kind of pointless in the armor slot. That's all we're talking about right now, by the way, just in the armor slot. And then as far as the diamond goes, you do not want to put the diamonds in your jewelry at all. This is something that I gotta like briefly mention real quick. But on top of that, there's barrier generation. If your build needs some sort of barrier for a very specific thing, there are other ways to get barrier on classes that you're normally not able to get to with that temerity, those pants that will also grant you barrier. Seems to be able to try out barrier generation on it, but for the most part, I wouldn't worry too much about it. So in terms of the armor pieces, in most scenarios, topazes and rubies are going to be your go-to. That's for every single piece of your gear. It kind of depends, what do you want to actually do? Is your character ranged? A lot of times when you are ranged, you don't need to be up in the thick of things, so a ruby can be a little bit better. But again, it depends on your playstyle. If you have the ability to get rid of any CC, like your cooldown is really good, you could have your teleport to break your CC or just move out of the way. You can use your, let's say, flame shield or any ability that gives you some sort of immune or unstoppable. Then at that point, yeah, rubies could be better. But again, you're going to have to break that stun in order to get that benefit. So that's your answer with the armors. Now, as far as the weapons go, there's a few different options. So, for example, over here, we actually have a sorceress for the gameplay. So it's one of the classes that can actually use a few different ones. Most classes will actually want to use the emerald. So what the emerald does is the emerald is going to give us extra critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. So when an enemy has that vulnerable condition, you have 12% crit multiplier in terms of our damage. So that's obviously really good. Now with the sorceress, we're playing an ice sorceress, so we are going to be chilling the enemies, which applies a crowd control. So in here, you'll see that I put a blue one in, which is going to be the sapphire. The blue one gives us extra critical strike damage to crowd controlled enemies. So it's the exact same one. Now bosses can't be crowd controlled until that stagger bar reaches all the way up. So having this is potentially a little bit better if your build does not consistently apply vulnerability. For example, on the Ice Shard Sorceress, you might not have 100% uptime on, let's say, your Frost Nova. So because you don't have 100% uptime, it may be better in some circumstances versus the smaller enemies to actually just use a Sapphire, because you can crowd control them by just hitting them with anything that will chill the enemy. So it's kind of, do you need more boss damage or do you want more damage against, let's say, smaller targets? However, rubies have what's called overpower. There are some builds on Necromancer as well as Druid, even Barb can do it, where you're going to be able to kind of set up to basically one-shot or get a huge hit for millions of damage, which is usually done with overpower mechanic. So rubies can be okay, but again, it's more of a niche thing. Most builds will always prefer to run emeralds in most cases because, again, the bosses, they're not going to be staggered and you cannot stagger or freeze the boss. So, having that extra crowd control is just not going to apply on the bosses. So for most builds, the emerald is going to be the choice. Now I've seen some people that do certain dot builds, and for dot builds you can do extra damage over time. That would be any fire build, that could be some of the poison or blight builds, the shadow damage that can apply over time for Necromancer, but for the most part you could still benefit more off of this in most circumstances anyways, but those are kind of the options with that. Now in terms of the other category, which is our last category, we're going to be talking about the jewelry. So this applies to your amulet. By the way, you can have one socket in the amulet and one socket in the rings. And as far as the weapons go, really briefly, two-handed weapons can have two sockets in them, and then one-handed weapons and an offhand can each have one socket. So the only items in the game that can have two sockets are going to be two-handed weapons, your pants, as well as your chest piece. But in terms of the jewelry, the skulls are going to be your go-to. So what do the skulls actually do? So the skull grants you armor. Armor is going to be superior, and like I mentioned before, as far as diamond goes, you do not want to put diamonds right now. In season 2, they are going to be buffing resistances. Right now, resistances are bad because they have diminishing returns, which means even though it says plus 8%, if you equip it, it might be only like 1%. So you get a lot less in terms of your damage reduction, whereas skulls, they grant you that armor. Armor in Diablo 4 will actually not only give you physical damage reduction, but also elemental damage reduction. So skulls right now are just going to be the go-to for every single class. Now, I know a lot of people have been taking an insane amount of poison damage because Blind Burrows is one of the most popular things. So I've heard people talk about using emeralds just for that. Honestly, you're still going to get better results in most circumstances by just using the skull, because this is all your damage, which includes physical. And swapping things in and out in terms of, I'm running this dungeon that does poison damage. For the most part, I would say it doesn't really matter too much. Like, I don't think it's worth unsocketing and resocketing. And another tip that I want to give you just in general, this is more so for leveling, but if you are using a gem, this is a question that I guess asked once in a while, is like, hey, should I like wait to save to put in my gem? Absolutely not. You're going to get a bunch of gems, and at some point you're just going to get so many that you just don't even pick them up, to be honest. So you can always socket your things in, and if you get a better item, what you do is you just salvage it. You don't always have to pay to unsocket. You can, instead of going to the jeweler and unsocketing, paying gold, just salvage the item. Once you get that item that has a better upgrade that you want to put your gem in, just salvage it. It's going to make it much easier for you. But anyways, that's going to go ahead and wrap it up. So just a quick little TLDR, topazes or rubies, this is for most players, in your armor. You're going to be wanting your emeralds in your weapons for most players, and then your skulls for your jewelry. So that basically wraps things up, and now I gave you guys the explanation on like when certain things would be better and why you would run them. Anyways, thanks for tuning in. If you guys enjoyed the video and this video helped you out, drop a like on it. If you're new here, hit subscribe, turn the bell so you don't miss out when we cover in the update what's going to be happening with some of these gems, because everyone's pretty much running the same, so hopefully they will make a new shift in the meta. But take care, see you on the next video. Peace.